Starting in late 1848 and then continuing in 1849, the revolutions which had rocked Europe started to fade away. In France, the Republic elected for itself a new president, a Napoleon Bonaparte, who would soon overthrow the Republic and make himself emperor. In Hungary, the Hungarian Revolution was crushed by the Russian army. In Italy, the Italian Revolution was crushed by the Austrian army. And in Germany too, the revolution was running out of steam. The German National Assembly in Frankfurt would have to come up with the final and definitive constitution of Germany quickly if they wanted their new empire to last. At this time, the various parties or factions within the National Assembly were beginning to be overlaid by just two major factions. The issue that was most strongly dividing the National Assembly was that of the future borders of Germany. Almost everybody believed that ideally Germany, or the new German Empire, should have the borders of the German Confederation, as well as the German territories of Eastern Prussia and the Duchy of Schleswig, which were also mostly German. But this border arrangement, called Greater Germany, had some problems because it would take huge amounts of territory from Denmark and Austria. Especially in Austria, it would make it impossible for Austria to even remain a state, since all of its most important and the entirety of its German territory would now be absorbed by the German Empire. While everybody ideally wanted there to be Greater Germany, many, at least half of the National Assembly, believed a much more practical solution to the borders of Germany was the Lesser Germany plan, by which Austria would not be a part of Germany, but would only be connected to the new German nation state through some future agreement. The disagreements between the Greater German and the Lesser German border option were making the National Assembly gridlocked and unable to pass anything. This gridlock of the two parties made it difficult to run the new German Empire, even for Prime Minister Heinrich von Gagern. But other than the border gridlock, there were some things which the two parties could agree on concerning the future constitution. We'll have a look at them. It was agreed, generally, that the future Germany should be a union of states, like the United States of America, in which federal power was to be split into three branches. The federal legislative branch was to be in the hands of a Reichstag, which was the same name as the old assembly of the First Empire. Reichstag was to be made up of two houses, one house of the people, to be elected directly by them, and one house for the representation of the states, of which half of the members were to be elected by the state legislatures, and the other half to be appointed by state governments. The judiciary power of the federal government was to be vested in a Supreme Court. As you can see, this setup is quite similar to the American Constitution. On the other hand, federal executive power, as was generally agreed, was to be officially in the hands of a head of state, but this person was only to act as a figurehead, and the real executive power was to be exercised by imperial ministers who would be accountable to the Reichstag. other than the border disagreements, another huge disagreement in the National Assembly was the question of who this head of state was going to be. There were several options. For example, there could be an emperor elected for life, as it was under the First Empire, or more modern, a hereditary monarch, or more republican, a president, or more like the old Confederation, a directory, to be appointed by the various state governments. Almost nobody supported an emperor for life, as this system had already sucked under the last empire. The option for hereditary emperor was supported by Heinrich von Gagern and the right-wing liberals. The option for president was supported by the more left-wing members of the National Assembly, and the option for directory was supported by those who felt more loyal to their states, like some Austrians or Bavarians. Let's look at option number 2, a republican president. Now, this was a very modern idea, but as Heinrich Gagern believed, and I would agree with him, it was also a very bad idea for this time. Heinrich von Gagern argued, correctly, that a German republic to be created in 1849 could not last. For one, the various monarchs of Germany would never accept a republican federal government as something that they had to submit to, and this new federal government did not have the power to force them to without fighting a war against them. And so, in this conflict of the monarchs against a republican government, it was only a question of time before one of them requested the assistance of the most conservative power in Europe, Russia, which was right next door. Just a few weeks ago, Russia had sent its troops into Hungary to crush the revolution there for the sake of the Austrians. So it was not very far-fetched at all to believe that they would do the same thing in Germany. So the new German Republic would almost immediately find itself entangled in a civil war and potentially a European or even world war with Russia. Let's look instead at the option of a directory to act as head of state. Under this framework, the cooperation of the various states with the new federal government would be guaranteed. But, as many say at the time, what was the point of the revolution if they were just going to have a government similar to the old federal diet, which they had overthrown? It was therefore argued that the only way to guarantee both peace and strength among the federal government and the states was to appoint a hereditary monarch. The title here now is interesting. They decided on the title of emperor, like at the last empire, but then of the Germans, not of Germany, which is to say ownership of a territory and its people, but of the Germans, like a democratic leader of a free people. Kind of like how Napoleon was called Emperor of the French, or King Louis was called King of the French. Under this plan, one of the monarchs, perhaps the Austrian monarch, since they had been the rulers of the old empire, would be appointed emperor over all of Germany, which would be more acceptable to the German monarchs and the other European states as this new emperor would be one of them. But, as it turns out, there was another secret plan that had been worked out behind closed doors of the Austrian government and was now being revealed to the public, the Schwarzenberg Plan. The new Prime Minister of Austria, Schwarzenberg, suggested to the other German states and to the National Assembly that instead of a German Empire, the German Confederation should be restored with some slight modifications. Under Schwarzenberg's plan, the territories of Prussia and Austria, which had previously not been a part of the German Confederation, would join it, and perhaps form a very large customs union as well. However, under such an arrangement where suddenly like half of the population wasn't even German, any kind of German democracy would become absolutely impossible. You can't have a German parliament that's going to be half filled by Hungarians and Poles who don't even want to be there in the first place. Schwarzenberg's plan would have made the National Assembly impossible, would have made a German constitution impossible, and would have meant the creation of a Central European conglomerate of states absolutely dominated by the conservative Austria. When the National Assembly was informed of the Schwarzenberg Plan, it hit the pro-Austrian Greater German faction like a brick in the face. The Austrian government had apparently turned decidedly against democracy and against the National Assembly. Under these circumstances, the Greater German Party collapsed, and was decided that Austria, as long as it was governed by this man, would have to be excluded from Germany. Now that the border question was finally settled, the former Lesser Germans, like Heinrich von Gagern, met with their left-wing opposition in the National Assembly. Gagern and his right liberals wanted there to be a hereditary emperor and an election system which was to be limited to property owners or taxpayers or educated people only, whereas the left-wing liberals wanted Germany to have a president in democratic elections. If they could not make a compromise, this ending of the party split would have been for nothing. But, as fate would have it, they did reach a compromise. The left-wingers agreed that they would vote in favor of a hereditary emperor, even though they really wanted a Republican president, and the right-wing liberals agreed that they would vote for democratic elections in the Reichstag, if it meant that this compromise could finally, after a whole year of work, create a German constitution. Since Austria would not be part of the now-to-be-created German nation-state, it was decided that the title of emperor should go to the monarch of Prussia, Frederick Wilhelm. It had taken more than a year of work, but finally it was finished. All of the struggles and all of the fights and all of the efforts had been for something. They had finally created the new constitution. Now all that was left was to celebrate and inform the Prussian king of his appointment. But the King of Prussia wavered and finally asked what the other German states thought of this constitution and his appointment. This was a disaster. There was no legal basis for these questions. Accepting the constitution was not up to the states or the king. The National Assembly alone had the right to pass the constitution, and it had passed it. The constitution was now law. The delegation obviously could not use such strong wording with their new emperor. Instead, they most politely informed His Majesty that if he didn't like the constitution, only the National Assembly could change it. Well, the king really didn't like the constitution. The king felt that a crown, which was the most dignified thing ever, could not possibly be given to anybody by the stinking, unwashed and uneducated people. A crown could only be bestowed upon a special person by the big man himself, by God and God only. So, to rectify this, since he himself was God appointed, he decided that if he had some changes to the constitution and the National Assembly accepted them, then that would be acceptable. So, the king's proposed changes were presented to the National Assembly. The right of the National Assembly generally agreed with the criticisms of the king, but the left of the National Assembly absolutely detested that the king was somehow putting himself above the sovereign people. In the final vote, the National Assembly decided to say no and insist on their original copy of the Constitution. Under these circumstances, the king felt that he would become a slave to the National Assembly if he accepted this imperial crown made from the dirt of the street, as he called it. The delegates in Berlin were greatly surprised by this and immediately rushed back to Frankfurt to tell the National Assembly what happened. As they arrived in Frankfurt with the news that the Prussian king had said no to the imperial crown of Germany, the National Assembly freaked out. This was impossible. How could this happen? They were saying that the king had no right to say no, that if the king didn't want it, they would just appoint somebody else, that they should enforce their constitution, which was the legal and binding constitution of Germany, with violence if necessary. Meanwhile, the new Frankfurt Constitution was getting known in Germany, and the people were loving it. They were loving it so much that 28 of Germany's medium and smaller sized states decided to adopt the Constitution, thereby effectively creating this definitive German Empire. This in turn created a paradoxical situation where the states were begging the King of Prussia to please become their emperor, and he was saying no. Since the Prussian king had apparently no feeling towards the requests of states, the people themselves decided to make their voices heard. And in 1849 there was a second revolution. Once again, barricades went up. The people wanted to force the King of Prussia to accept the constitution and the crown, whether he wanted to or not. The king met with various other German monarchs who had been either overthrown or limited in their powers by the revolutions of the previous and the ongoing year. Somehow, they were getting along much better than the king had gotten along with the deputation of the National Assembly. Finally, the king decided to order his troops to crush the revolution once and for all. And so it was. The Prussian army marched into the smaller states at the behest of their former monarchs and crushed the revolution, restoring them to power. As Prussian troops were now making their way into Frankfurt, many members of the National Assembly fled. Seeing the way the wind was blowing, Regent Archduke John decided to dismiss his ministers of the Provisional Imperial Government and instead staff it with conservatives in an attempt to appease the Prussian and Austrian counter-revolution. But it wasn't enough. Prussia and Austria demanded the dissolution of the provisional government, and so it was. Those members of the National Assembly who had flown made their way to Stuttgart, where they would have their last stand. This rump parliament in Stuttgart decided to make some new laws that nobody really listened to, like appointing somebody else as regent since they felt betrayed Archduke John, and decreeing that the Prussian king was a very naughty boy, and also banning gambling in Germany. But nobody listened to these laws anymore, so it didn't matter. Finally, the Prussian army showed up and dissolved this charade. The revolution was over. It had failed. With this embarrassing failure of revolution began a period of mass exodus. The people, seeing their revolution end in such a disgraceful way, started emigrating to America or even Switzerland for the more politically Republican ones in this period. The future of Germany would once again be in the hands of its monarchs.